the protests looked, the way they acted there, repeatedly, I spoke with participants there, with people who saw it, they say, no, there on the streets, there were no demands. They are not even able to formulate a cause which can be utopian communist, which can be religious, but just pure violence, and the only cause, or however you call it, agenda is imitate consumerism.
Well,
that's very sad.
Here in the United States, do you see any kind of a coherent ideological demand?
No, but I don't blame them. Listen, I am not a naive communist. I am the first to say, this really made me many enemies, when I said, let's face it, 20th century communism was precisely because it started with such hopes and ended in a nightmare, was maybe the greatest catastrophe, ethical catastrophe, I'm almost tempted to say, in the history of humanity, more than fascism. You know why? Because let's be very simple. In fascism, we have bad guys who said, our program is to do this and these bad things, no? And what a surprise, they took power, they did bad things, no? In communism, you have authentic tragedy, which is why you have dissidents, you have always inner struggles. So, but nonetheless, it is over that. And what does this mean? This means that let's not bluff. We see the limitations of the existing system. I stand here at my basic position, which is, when people say, oh, you are utopian, sorry, the only true utopia for me is that things can go on indefinitely the way they are. With just some, you know, the way it looked at the beginning of 2008 financial breakdown. Okay, our legislation concerning banks was not good enough, we changed that a little bit, everything will be okay. No, it's not that. So something will have to be done. But let's face it openly, the tragedy is that I don't know, we don't know, what effective forum can replace capitalist democratic system the way we have it now. Now I will quote someone to whom I am, of course, totally opposed politically, but sometimes she is not stupid. Ayn Rand, you know, Atlas Shrugged. Right. When in her ridiculous hymn to money, she says, money is, in a way, a means of liberty, in the sense of we have to divide things, exchange, and so on. She says, money means we can do it peacefully. I pay you, you sell it to me only if you want to. If not money, then there has to be some kind of direct domination, brutal extortion, whatever. I don't agree with her here, but doesn't she have here a point, in the sense that isn't a big experience of 20th century communism that they wanted to abolish market money and direct brutal domination, masterhood returned with vengeance?
Okay, but I've read some of what you've said, and what you've said is fascism of the left, if that's the means necessary, so be it, right? So what do you mean by fascism of the left?
This was to provoke my liberal friends, right, who are, I like, you know, I like to provoke, like there are much worse things that I've said. For example, I've said, and it gave almost a heart attack to some of my friends.
We don't take you literally, is that what you're saying?
No. Why not? Because, you know, all the, the problem is the problem of violence. Of course I am opposed to violence, when by it we mean killing, torturing people, and so on. But for me, true violence, which I support, is not physical violence, but violence when you say, like the violence of Egyptian demonstrators on Tahrir Square. They were violent in the formal sense that they didn't just shoot and so on. They wanted the whole system to stop functioning. This is why my famous statement, which brought me so many enemies, is the first part is, the problem with Hitler was that he wasn't violent enough, but then the second part, in the sense in which Gandhi was more violent than Hitler. Hitler's all violence was to make the system work. Gandhi wanted to stop it. So this is, for me, the problem, this obsession with the violence, demonization of of course, it should be demonized violence, but before doing that, we should also see all the forms of violence. We should see violence which is invisible, not because I'm not a paranoiac, because some bad media controlled by I don't know whom prevent us seeing it. But just think, for example, you want to talk about violence? Talk about Republic of Congo today. Millions dying, the whole state doesn't function, warlords dominate, you have drugged child warriors and so on. This is the violence which we don't notice too much because it's part of the system. So all I'm saying is let's expand our notion of violence. The same thing I wrote about in Guardian, the British daily newspaper, about West Bank. Okay, I unambiguously condemned violence of Palestinian or whichever terrorism there. But my point was, what happens there when nothing happens? By nothing happens,
nothing changes.
Yeah, nothing big for the media. No one is killed, blah, blah. This everyday suffocating bureaucratic occupation of Israel, you know, poisoning wells, burning trees, slowly pushing Palestinians out. This is the reality. Without getting this background, you don't get the whole picture.
But you're not talking about any ideological solution to, for example, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, are you?
What do you mean by ideological solution?
Well, you're talking about when things don't change there, then it's regarded as the norm.
Yeah, but, and we should see violence in that normal state.
Right, but is there an ideological approach to responding to this rather than what looks to everyone else as a nationalistic or maybe a religious conflict?
You know, the whole problem here is, what does the term ideology mean? For me, ideology is present more and more at the level of daily lives. We live in a very strange era where, at least in the West, people think they are outside ideology. Like, take average people today. What is the implicit injunction that you get from society, in education, whatever? It's not sacrifice yourself for a big cause. It's something like be true to yourself, have a full life, realize your potentials. It's a kind of a, what I call spiritualized hedonism, no? So people don't experience it as ideology, but I think we are in ideology, precisely because ideology is, for me, the way you see things and you don't see things so that you can function in our daily lives. For example, the fact that we cannot imagine a change means ideology. Or to give you another example, did you notice how today problems of racism and sexism, which are very real problems, are automatically translated into problems of tolerance? This is ideology. Look at Martin Luther King. He never practically mentions tolerance. For him, the problem was not, oh, whites should more tolerate us blacks. The problem was what? Economic exploitation, legal rights, everyday racism, and so on. To perceive this problem as the problem of tolerance, you already accept a certain vision of society where, you know, there are almost naturalized cultural differences, and we should learn to tolerate each other, and so on and so on. Politics proper disappears here.
Do you see anywhere in the world where that concept of the left is actually trying to actualize that?
Things are slowly happening. I mean, but our media are here not covering it enough. For example, I was surprised, just take how the media cover India and China. China is the bad guy, everybody knows, bad communists and so on, terrorizing Tibet. But do you know that in India, from time to time you get a note, but it's not reported enough. You have a mega Maoist Naxalite rebellion. According to most of the estimates we are talking about, okay, India is big, but nonetheless it's a number even for India. Over 1 million armed rebels. Horrible things are happening when Indian new capitalism is trying to expand into these tribal areas to get access to money. And we simply don't see it. So there is a rebellion there. There are things happening now even in Europe. These things are very serious. It's not just the superficial things, or will Greece pay its debts or not. It's basically, to put it in one of possible ways. First, it is that Europe, I like to quote this metaphor, you know, Sigmund Freud, when he was old, asked this ridiculous, naive question, was will das Weib? What does a woman want? I claim, no, today it's the problem, what does Europe want? Europe cannot decide. On the one hand, we have this pure technocratic Brussels vision, we should just organize ourselves with regard to global market to be competitive. Then we have this nationalist anti-immigrant movements. It's very sad if this is the only alternative. I think that today the world is asking for a real alternative. Look, would you like, I wouldn't, to live in a world where the only alternative is either Anglo-Saxon neoliberalism or Chinese Singaporean, as we poetically call it, capitalism with Asian values, which means authoritarian capitalism, which is now turning even more effective than Western liberal capitalism. So something will have to be done, and that's the tragedy of Europe. That's the first one. The second one, I'm such a pessimist, unfortunately, in Europe, how Europe is regressing. Look, one incident. You know that European Union basically didn't want to allow in Turkey for not being democratic enough, whatever. Okay, maybe.
Or not being Islamic, or being too Islamic.
But let me tell you something. Did you notice this? This summer, there was in Istanbul a